Hey guys, tonight we are stepping into the crowded, noisy streets of ancient Rome, where the air smells faintly of olive oil, dust, and too many bodies pressed together. You find yourself wandering into a place that is at once familiar, like a farmer's market with stalls and shouting vendors, and yet deeply unsettling, because instead of grapes or fish, the merchandise here is human beings. That's right. We're easing into the Roman slave market where lives were displayed, priced, and bargained over with the same casualness as a basket of figs. And yes, you probably won't survive this, because if you did, you'd either end up broke, exhausted, or accidentally sold off as merchandise yourself. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight, so post your location and the local time in the comments. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The crowd presses close as you shuffle into the forum's open square. Marble columns gleam under the Mediterranean sun, their shadows slicing across the pavement where wooden platforms have been hastily hammered together. On these platforms stand men, women, and children, some with chalk marks on their feet, others holding placards around their necks announcing their skills. You see one scrawled with Cocos Optimus, excellent cook. Another just says novice, new, untrained, basically a blank slate for the buyer's imagination. Vendors shout in Latin, voices rising over the braying of donkeys and the distant clatter of carts. You hear claims of strong backs, nimble fingers, and even pure voices for singing. Some sellers slap their product on the shoulder, showing off muscle tone like butchers squeezing a side of beef. Historians still argue whether chalk on the feet really meant just arrived, or if it also signaled someone free from debt obligations, but the visual is undeniable. Every body is tagged like inventory. One fact you can't miss, Roman law actually required sellers to disclose defects. Yes, even in this grim market, consumer protection was a thing. If someone had epilepsy or a habit of running away or, heaven forbid, spoke up too much, the seller had to state it or risk being sued later. Imagine walking past and hearing an auctioneer calling out healthy, strong, only tried to escape twice, not exactly the catchy sales pitch of the year. But here's a quirky tidbit. Some slaves were displayed naked, not out of cruelty, though that was certainly present, but to prove there were no hidden scars or diseases. Rome, in its blunt practicality, stripped everything down to inspection. Literally, buyers would poke at teeth and joints the way we kick car tires. You shuffle nervously, realizing how clinical it all feels, like livestock or merchandise. In the heat of the day, the marketplace feels both energetic and eerie. The wealthier citizens stroll in with their attendants, purses heavy with coins. They shade themselves with parasols while casually discussing whether a tall Thracian might make a good guard or if a literate Greek boy could serve as tutor. To them, it's an afternoon errand, like you debating which brand of cereal to buy. And you, standing in the crowd, can't help but feel the surreal hum of human commerce all around you. The average citizen watches, too. You overhear one muttering that the influx of cheap slaves is ruining free laborers' chances at steady work. It's like showing up to apply for a job and realizing the employer can just buy someone to do it instead. The Roman economy turns on this imbalance, and you feel the frustration simmering under the surface. Historians still argue whether this reliance on slavery ultimately hollowed out Rome's middle class, setting the stage for collapse centuries later. As you step closer, a group of captured Gauls is marched in, shackles clinking like wind chimes, but heavier, more ominous. Their pale hair and tall frames stand out in the Mediterranean crowd. A seller proclaims their strength for farming or soldiering. Prices spike when fresh war captives flood the market. The law of supply and demand has no mercy here. You imagine yourself a Roman shopper, weighing whether to invest in one strong laborer or three smaller, less expensive field hands. The math is dizzying, the morality absent. You notice another scene, a young boy clutching a wax tablet, nervous eyes darting. His placard claims he knows arithmetic. A wealthy matron leans in, whispering to her steward. Perhaps she sees a future accountant for her villa. Perhaps she just thinks he'd look neat in livery. The boy shifts uncomfortably, and you feel the weight of futures decided by a stranger's whim. And yes, even the auctioneer knows how to milk the crowd. With the flourish of a raised arm, he calls for silence, then rattles off the virtues of his next lot. Strong, healthy, and ladies and gentlemen, he can juggle amphorae. A chuckle ripples through the crowd. Romans appreciated a party trick, even in the bleakest of contexts. You almost laugh too, but then the reality hits again. This juggling act is someone's life, reduced to entertainment value. The atmosphere is thick with contradictions, casual cruelty mixed with sharp-eyed commerce, grim suffering paired with the mundane rhythm of buying and selling. You wander deeper into the market, brushing against silk tunics of the wealthy and the rough wool of poorer onlookers. The sound of coins clinking, voices bargaining, and children crying blends into a sleepy, oddly hypnotic hum. And just when you think you've seen it all, a rumor drifts through the crowd. Tomorrow, a Greek philosopher is going up for sale, captured in some provincial skirmish. Imagine browsing the human marketplace and deciding between a philosopher and a mule. You can't help smirking at the absurdity. Some Romans probably thought they were getting ripped off either way. The day draws on, and you're left with the surreal image of a society where buying people was as routine as buying bread. The stone columns, the dusty heat, the murmurs of the crowd, all of it seeps into your senses until it feels like you've always been here, drifting through a market that was both utterly ordinary and profoundly unsettling. You leave the market square with its shouts and chalk-marked feet still echoing in your head, but now your mind drifts to the numbers, the coins, the hard arithmetic of how much a Roman slave actually cost. You hear the clink of bronze asses and the heavier thud of silver denarii, maybe even the sharp gleam of a golden aureus, and you realize this whole system ran not just on bodies but on careful sums. Picture yourself with a small purse in your hand. How far could it stretch? For the average unskilled laborer, someone fit enough to carry baskets or dig trenches, the price might be the equivalent of a few hundred denarii. That's the rough cost of a serviceable donkey, which tells you something about how the Romans thought. A strong man reduced to the level of a beast of burden, appraised not by his dreams or humor, but by the endurance of his back. And yet, if you wanted someone skilled, say a Greek physician or literate scribe trained in shorthand, you'd better be ready to part with thousands of denarii. There are records of highly educated slaves selling for the price of an entire country villa. Imagine going to the market thinking, should I buy this house with a courtyard, or this one guy who can teach my kids Homer? Only Rome could make such math seem practical. Historians still argue whether these astronomically high numbers were the norm, or just rare brag-worthy anecdotes, but even the possibility says plenty. Of course, the quirks of the market meant you could also find bargains. A slave who had scars, a reputation for illness, or was simply too old might be sold cheaply, almost like a clearance sale. And yes, the Romans did clearance sales. Picture a stall at the far edge of the forum with weary eyes staring back at you, people past their prime, yet still shuffled into someone's ledger. You hear the seller grumble, half price, no warranties, you take the risk. It's darkly comic if you can stomach it. One tidbit you can't forget, sometimes slaves came with a guarantee. Roman contracts could stipulate that if your new purchase fell sick or turned out to be a runaway, you could demand your money back. It's the ancient equivalent of a store return policy. Can you imagine waiting in line with a receipt explaining to a clerk, yes, this fellow keeps escaping, do you have one in a different size? Your feet shuffle across sun-warmed stones as you consider the broader scale. For perspective, a Roman legionary earned about 900 sesterces a year. Buying even a basic field slave might cost him 2 to 3 years' salary. So unless he won the lottery of plunder, the average soldier couldn't stroll into the market and casually pick out household staff. Slaves were overwhelmingly the property of the wealthy, their villas and estates humming with bought labor. For everyone else, it remained a world slightly out of reach, like gazing through the glass at a luxury store. But there were exceptions. Some lower-status Romans pooled resources to buy 1 or 2 slaves for shared use, a bit like roommates today splitting the cost of Wi-Fi. You chuckle at the thought, sorry, I need the household slave from 3 to 5 p.m. for laundry duty. Don't hog him all day. The sensory atmosphere lingers as you imagine coins exchanging hands. A buyer counts carefully, the metallic clatter echoing against marble colonnades. A seller licks his thumb to tally notes on a wax tablet. Somewhere nearby, a slave blinks nervously, waiting to see whose life they'll be folded into. The tension between cold arithmetic and warm human pulse is stark. And still there were moments of extravagance. Wealthy Romans competed not only in villas and feasts, but in the caliber of their enslaved household staff. One senator might boast of owning a philosopher to tutor his children in stoicism. Another might brag that his doorman was imported from Britain for his noble barbarian appearance. The bragging rights alone justified the price tags. Historians still argue whether this was genuine competition or satire exaggerated by Roman writers, but you can hear the smugness dripping off their words, and either way. As you pace through this thought experiment, you can almost smell the coin bags, leather softened by use, cords tied tight. You run your thumb across a denarius, the emperor's profile staring back at you, unblinking as though he too approves of this strange economy. The market hushes for a moment in your imagination, and all you hear is that little clink, 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 a lullaby of cold silver, soothing and yet quietly unsettling. Your mind wanders. If you were in Rome, would you save for years to buy one person? Would you gamble on a discount slave, hoping they could still be trained? Or would you stand back, uncomfortable, never quite able to see human beings as rows of figures in an account book? These are questions the Romans rarely asked themselves, but you, lying back tonight, can let the weight of them drift softly in your mind. And perhaps the oddest reality check is this. By our standards, the slaves were both incredibly expensive and yet disturbingly normal to purchase, a paradox, much like Rome itself, grand and brutal, opulent and absurd. You wander deeper into this imagined Roman marketplace, your sandals scuffing against the cobbles as another thought drifts in. Not all slaves cost the same, because not all slaves were meant for the same kind of work. Tonight, you're sorting through a very Roman contrast between the bargain bin of basic field hands and the eye-watering luxury buys of musicians, tutors, and philosophers. It's like comparing a plain loaf of bread with a diamond-encrusted cake. Both fill a need, but one is meant to impress at dinner parties far more than the other. First, the bargain. You step toward a stall at the edge of the forum where a farmer, his toga spotted with olive oil stains, is haggling for two sturdy men from Gaul. They're young, broad-shouldered, and clearly destined for hard labor in the fields. The price is low by Roman standards, just enough to stock a small farm with extra muscle. The farmer rubs his calloused hands, already imagining them pruning vines or hauling grain sacks. You can almost hear his thoughts. 2 workers for less than the cost of a decent mule. Perfect. The sensory detail is simple here. The smell of sweat, hay, and earthy bodies. There's no elegance, no finesse. Buying farmhands was the Aldi shopping trip of the Roman world. But then you turn your head, and the atmosphere shifts completely. Over by the shaded portico, senators in snowy white togas lean in, voices soft and serious. They're bidding on something altogether different, a Greek slave trained in rhetoric, someone who can recite Homer by memory and correct your child's accent. The price? Astronomical. We're talking enough to buy an entire vineyard or two. Imagine walking into Sotheby's today, but instead of bidding on a painting, you're competing for a person who can quote Plato with better diction than your dinner guests. And the Romans loved showing off. A wealthy patron could host a banquet, and while the guests reclined on couches, nibbling dates and honey cakes, a hired singer, often a slave, would strum the lyre and croon in flawless Greek. The cost of owning such a performer was immense, but the prestige, priceless. Historians still argue whether the reported sums, tens of thousands of sesterces, were typical or exaggerated for bragging rights, but even the exaggerations tell you how luxurious the idea was. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some slaves specialized in jokes. Yes, the Romans essentially purchased comedians to liven up dinner. You picture a rotund senator leaning back, wine cup in hand, roaring with laughter at a pun delivered by his very own enslaved jester. It's almost surreal, buying someone to guarantee you chuckle before dessert. Of course, not every luxury was so whimsical. Tutors were perhaps the most expensive investments. Families poured fortunes into ensuring their sons could master Greek and Latin, rhetoric, mathematics, and philosophy. Imagine you're a Roman mother, carefully inspecting a candidate. Can he quote Virgil? Does he know geometry? And, most importantly, will he stop my son from making fart jokes in class? The decision mattered because a child's future political career depended on polish and wit. Then there were body servants, the kind who were trained to anticipate needs before you even voiced them. You stretch out your arm, and a cloak is draped on it instantly. You glance toward the kitchen, and wine is already being poured. Such seamless service required training, and trained slaves fetched higher prices. Think of it like hiring a luxury butler, only you were buying them outright. You stop for a moment, listening to the buzz of the forum. To one side, coins clink modestly in the hands of a farmer, satisfied with his inexpensive purchases. To the other, gold aurae exchange hands in staggering amounts. while a senator murmurs about his new acquisition's flawless ability to compose poetry on demand. Two economies side by side, one rooted in sweat and soil, the other in glittering performance and intellect. And here's where historians scratch their heads. Was Rome more dependent on cheap bulk labor or on these elite specialists? Some argue the economy truly ran on the backs of agricultural slaves. Others insist that the cultural prestige of educated Greek captives shaped Rome's identity more profoundly. You can almost picture a group of scholars squabbling over it while sipping lukewarm coffee. No, the farmhands fed the empire. But the tutors civilized it. The truth is, both were essential. Without the cheap field workers, Rome would have starved. Without the expensive intellectuals, Rome wouldn't have strutted around bragging about its sophistication. Both bargain buys and luxury acquisitions made the system tick. So as you drift further into the scene, you realize Rome's marketplace wasn't just about coins and prices, it was about image. A poor farmer needed bodies to keep his land productive. A senator needed brilliance and refinement to keep his dinner parties dazzling. Each purchase said something not only about wealth, but about identity. And in that contrast, sweaty hands gripping hoes versus elegant fingers strumming a lyre, you glimpse the bizarre spectrum of value placed on human life in the Roman world. You've now seen the prices, the bargains, and the luxury buys, but the story doesn't stop once the coins change hands. In Rome, the cost of a slave was never just the purchase price. It was the ongoing expense of feeding, clothing, housing, and maintaining that investment. Think of it as the world's grimmest version of total cost of ownership. You might buy a cheap mule, but it still eats, and so did your enslaved workforce. Tonight, you're wandering through the hidden balance sheet of ancient households, the upkeep that turned every purchase into a long-term calculation. You start by picturing yourself back in that villa courtyard, shaded by fig trees, mosaic tiles glowing in the warm sun. The master has just bought a new household slave, and the initial expense was staggering enough. But now comes the upkeep. Grain, olive oil, cheap wine, maybe a few onions or chickpeas. This is the basic ration. Roman masters often issued allowances called ciboria to feed their slaves. Nothing fancy, no honey cakes or roast dormice, just enough to keep bodies moving. You can almost smell the porridge simmering, bland and steady, filling bellies without delighting them. Here's a mainstream fact. Records suggest an average male slave might consume roughly the same rations as a poor free laborer: bread, porridge, and legumes. Meat was rare, but salted fish sauce, garum, sometimes made an appearance. It wasn't generous, but it kept people alive. Imagine ladling out the same meal day after day, a diet so predictable you could count time by it. But food was only the beginning. Clothing, too, came out of the master's purse. Woolen tunics in the winter, lighter linen in the summer, maybe a cloak if your job involved standing outdoors at a villa gate. Shoes? Only if you were lucky, and sometimes only if your work required it. You, strolling past the storeroom, see bundles of rough fabric waiting to be distributed. A steward keeps track of it all on wax tablets, tallying every tunic and sandal. The arithmetic was relentless. Clothe 20 slaves, feed 20 slaves, watch the costs stack like amphorae of wine in a cellar. Housing had its place on the list too. In wealthy villas, slaves often slept in cramped quarters near their work. Small, dark rooms tucked behind kitchens or cellars. In cities, they might bed down under staircases or in attic-like lofts above workshops. You imagine the close smell of straw pallets, sweat, and oil lamps burning low. Not exactly glamorous, but every square foot of shelter was another line in the invisible budget. And here comes the quirky tidbit. Some masters actually gave their slaves a small allowance called peculium. On the surface, this was a reward system, letting slaves buy small luxuries, or in rare cases, save up to purchase freedom. But from the master's perspective, it was also practical. A slave who could manage his own tiny budget was often more motivated and less rebellious. It's like giving your employee a company credit card, but reminding them you can take it away anytime. As you wander further, you overhear two landowners comparing costs. One brags that he keeps expenses low by buying in bulk, sacks of grain directly from a merchant, distributed like rations in a military camp. Another sighs that his investment in a Greek tutor is bleeding him dry, since the man insists on more delicate food and warmer clothes. Historians still argue whether luxury slaves truly cost more to maintain, or whether Roman writers exaggerated to poke fun at elites. Either way, the image is clear. Upkeep wasn't a side note, it was the drumbeat behind every purchase. And then there's healthcare, if you can call it that. Masters had to weigh whether to invest in a doctor for their enslaved workforce. Some wealthy households kept a physician slave whose job was to patch up injuries and brew herbal remedies. Others took the cheaper route, a poultice of herbs, maybe a bandage, or simply letting nature take its course. You imagine standing in a dim kitchen where one slave grinds dried plants into a paste for another's wound, the smell, sharp and earthy. The calculation is always there. How much is this life worth to keep in working order? You catch yourself smirking at the modern parallel. It's almost like buying a fancy gadget and realizing the real cost is in batteries, repairs, and subscription fees. The Romans, of course, didn't see the irony. They just balanced their ledgers, groaned at the expenses, and reminded themselves that slaves were investments, not just purchases. One debate continues to swirl among historians. Did Roman masters generally treat slaves better when they cost more to maintain, or was cruelty so ingrained that upkeep was begrudging even for expensive household staff? The evidence points both ways, leaving you with that unresolved tension, an empire powered by numbers, yet riddled with contradictions. As the evening breeze drifts through the villa courtyard, you realize the sound of coins isn't the only music in this system. There's the endless rustle of grain sacks, the creak of wool looms, the scratch of styluses marking expenses, all of it a lullaby of hidden costs, a reminder that ownership never ended at the marketplace. It followed you home, whispering from every storeroom and ledger. You drift from the storerooms and ledgers of upkeep back into the marketplace itself, where one thing becomes clear: Romans didn't just haggle, they performed. Tonight, you're surrounded by the cries of auctioneers, the scratch of chalk across feet, and placards swinging from necks as sellers advertise their merchandise with a flair that makes you think of used car salesmen centuries before the invention of the wheel rim. You walk along the edge of the square. A wooden platform creaks under the weight of nervous figures, each standing stiffly while a crier bellows their virtues. One man is introduced as strong enough to carry 3 amphorae without complaint. Another, a young girl, is said to sing in 2 languages. The crowd murmurs, coins clinking softly in purses as they measure worth in voices and muscles. Here's the mainstream fact. Roman slave auctions were so common that legal regulations dictated exactly how they should run. Sellers were supposed to state defects openly, and failure to do so could lead to lawsuits. Imagine a buyer fuming weeks later. "This slave was epileptic. I demand my denarii back." Roman courts actually heard such complaints, and rulings survive in legal records. You can almost picture the toga-clad version of a small claims court, but to catch the eye, sellers leaned on spectacle. Chalk marks on the feet signaled fresh arrival. Placards called tittily swung like medieval shop signs, scrawled with details, skills, origins, even warranties. You pause at one placard that reads simply "Fugitivus, runaway." At least the seller is honest. The buyer shrugs. Maybe the risk means a lower price. Maybe the thrill of taming a rebellious spirit adds a strange allure. The quirky tidbit: sometimes the auctioneer would puff up the merchandise with overblown promises, like boasting that a man was descended from warriors or that a seamstress had fingers faster than Mercury himself. Think of it as Roman marketing, equal parts exaggeration and desperate charm. You smirk, half expecting a jingle to erupt from the forum steps. Buy 1 Thracian, get the second half price. Your ears ring with the rhythm of the bidding. A hand lifts, a voice calls 50 denarii, another raises 70. The auctioneer's patter builds, quick and hypnotic, until the hammer, or more often a shouted conclusion, settles the matter. The sold figure is led away, placard removed, life redirected by the toss of a coin purse. Not every sale was so lively, though. Sometimes a private negotiation happened in the shadow of a column, with quiet words and a discreet exchange. Picture yourself lingering nearby, hearing a buyer mutter about scars or haggling down because of a limp. Historians still argue whether public auctions were the majority or whether these quieter, almost whispered transactions dominated everyday trade. Evidence suggests both happened, depending on scale and prestige. And then There was presentation. Sellers scrubbed, oiled, and sometimes even perfumed their slaves before auction. A splash of olive oil could make skin glisten, muscles stand out, and scars less obvious. You catch the scent in the air, sharp, earthy, masking sweat, but never quite erasing it. It's theater, plain and simple. The Romans dressed up commerce with cosmetics. But the comedy creeps in again when you imagine the inevitable false advertising. What if your excellent cook couldn't boil lentils? What if your perfect singer croaked like a toad once you brought him home? Romans had legal recourse, but you know the feeling. It's buyer's remorse 2,000 years early. And unlike your faulty toaster, the refund process was probably even more awkward. The crowd swells around you, warm bodies pressing close. Children dart through, chasing each other between togas while sellers bark louder to be heard over the din. You notice the layering of sound, low murmurs of calculation, bursts of laughter at some exaggerated claim, the steady scratch of styluses on wax tablets as attendants keep track of bids. It's chaotic, yet oddly soothing, like the rise and fall of a marketplace lullaby. As the sun dips lower, shadows stretching across the square, you catch sight of a boy wiping chalk from his toes. Sold. His placard lies discarded on the stones, the ink smudged by a passing foot. For the crowd, it's just another sale, another tally in the day's accounts. For him, it's everything. And so, in this strange blend of spectacle, legality, and theater, you realize Roman slave auctions weren't just about the transaction. They were about display, persuasion, and the endless human urge to dress up even the bleakest commerce with a little showmanship. The din of the auction fades, and now your mind drifts to the larger rhythm of Rome itself, the tides of supply and demand that kept the markets in constant motion. Slavery in Rome wasn't a small trickle, it was a flood, and the floodwaters rose and fell with every battle and conquest. Tonight, you're wandering not just a marketplace, but the currents of an entire empire where war was the #1 supplier of human cargo. You start with the soundscape, the clatter of soldiers' armor, the groans of captives marching in chains, the cheers of Roman citizens as victorious generals paraded their spoils through the streets. A triumph in Rome wasn't only about golden treasures or exotic animals, it was about the long line of prisoners of war trailing behind. Each one represented potential wealth, fresh stock for the slave markets, and prices would fluctuate the moment they entered the city. Here's a solid fact. After major campaigns like Julius Caesar's conquest of Gaul, tens of thousands of captives were sold into slavery almost overnight. The market, flooded with supply, saw prices plummet. Imagine being a buyer standing in the forum that week. You could pick up a Gaul for the cost of a cheap dinner, but give it a few months when the flood slowed to a trickle, and suddenly those same bodies were worth far more. Historians still argue whether these fluctuations destabilized the economy or whether Rome simply absorbed the shocks like a sponge, but the evidence of wild price swings is undeniable. You pause picturing the math. It's like buying seasonal fruit. When the orchards burst, peaches are cheap. When winter comes, you pay dearly for the last shriveled ones. In Rome, peaches were people. You let that unsettling analogy settle in your mind like an overripe fig. Of course, not every supply source was a grand military victory. Smaller-scale captures happened constantly. Piracy, border raids, even debt slavery in earlier centuries. You imagine a group of traders arriving at Ostia, Rome's bustling port, unloading amphorae of wine, bundles of wool, and, oh yes, a handful of unlucky Cappadocians tied at the wrists. A buyer might haggle casually as if picking over spices, deciding whether these new arrivals were hardy enough for farm labor. The quirky tidbit, Roman writers sometimes complained about too many slaves entering the city. One satirist groaned that a Roman household could be stuffed with foreign tongues, Gauls in the kitchen, Syrians in the stables, Greeks teaching the children, and Germans looming as guards. It's like living in a house where every room is staffed by someone from a different continent. Confusing for dinner conversation, perhaps, but also a bragging right for the elite. The more exotic your staff, the richer you looked. And yet, the supply-demand dynamic created real problems. With so many captives flooding in, free laborers often struggled to compete. Imagine you're a poor Roman citizen, hoping to earn a living hauling bricks, only to find your potential employer has bought 3 captives for the same cost of hiring you for a month. It's no wonder resentment simmered, even if few dared challenge the system outright. Historians still argue whether this contributed to Rome's infamous bread and circuses policy, distracting the restless poor with free food and entertainment. As you stroll mentally through these shifts, you feel the strange rhythm of Rome's economy. War brings supply, supply lowers prices, peace raises them again, and all the while the city hums with the background noise of human commerce. It's unsettlingly predictable, like the tide, yet also wildly unstable when the waves crashed in too fast. You picture one particular day, the aftermath of a major battle. The forum is packed shoulder to shoulder, auction platforms sagging under the sheer number of new captives. Sellers shout themselves hoarse, but buyers grin. They know this is the moment to stock up. Prices drop so low that even moderately wealthy citizens can afford an extra hand for the kitchen or the fields. You shake your head at the absurdity. War is a clearance sale. And just as suddenly, in quieter years, the tone changes. The market slows, the platforms hold fewer bodies, and buyers mutter at the higher prices. They grumble, but still they pay, because the Roman machine doesn't run without enslaved labor. You hear it in their voices, resentment, calculation, but also dependency. It all leaves you with an odd sense of hypnosis, the clink of coins, the rise and fall of prices, the endless cycle of capture and sale. You realize Rome's entire economy was built on this rhythm, and without it, the empire might have looked very different. As you let the thought drift, the sound of distant marching feet fades like a lullaby. The empire sleeps best when its supply is steady, even if that supply is measured in lives. The chatter of prices and the flow of supply fade into another layer of the marketplace, one where appearances, scars, and ancestry shift a person's value like features on a coin. Tonight, you're weaving through the rows of platforms again, noticing how the details of branding, ethnicity, and physical signs could make a slave's price rise or plummet in the blink of an eye. Your eye is first drawn to a tall, broad-shouldered man with a shaved head. A faint burn mark scars his forehead, a branded letter, the unmistakable sign of having once been caught as a runaway. In Rome, such marks were permanent warnings. Buyers saw them as flashing red flags. This one may bolt again. His price dips, not because his body lacks strength, but because his reputation is written into his skin. You wince, realizing how a single brand altered his entire value in the cold arithmetic of the market. Mainstream fact, branding runaway slaves was common, often with the letters fugue for fugitivus burned into the flesh. This wasn't just punishment, it was advertising, a way for the marketplace itself to police honesty. Sellers had to disclose defects, and a brand was a defect made visible. But across the platform, another figure draws more attention. A Greek youth, slim, curly-haired, with clear skin and careful posture. No scars, no brands, a placard proclaiming he can read and write. His ethnicity, Greek, boosts his value enormously. Romans adored Greek culture, and a literate Greek slave was considered both a luxury and an investment. Buyers gather quickly, voices low, purses heavy. The quirky tidbit, some Romans believed certain ethnicities came pre-packaged with traits. Syrians were said to make excellent accountants, Thracians fierce guards, Germans loyal body servants. It was all stereotype, of course, but stereotype shaped price. You smirk at the absurdity. Imagine walking into a modern store and seeing a label. Comes with free sarcasm, excellent at spreadsheets. Rome did exactly that. Children, too, carried their own strange value markers. A child without scars or defects might fetch a decent price, not because they were useful yet, but because they could be trained. Think of it as buying potential. On the flip side, a child with obvious weakness might be passed over, their price barely covering food. You pause at the thought, a heart heavier than before, realizing that human futures were itemized like goods in a catalog. And scars weren't always negative. In some cases, they were spun as proof of experience. A gladiator with healed wounds could be marketed as seasoned, a survivor who might fetch high bids for entertainment value. Historians still argue whether buyers truly believed scars could be reframed as assets, or whether this was just auctioneers stretching the truth to make a sale. Either way, it's salesmanship at its darkest. You drift closer to a trader's stall where placards dangle from strings. One reads, 20 years old, strong, good with animals. Another, from Cappadocia, literate, healthy. The origins alone sway the bids. Cappadocians were prized for their horsemanship. A farmer in the crowd grins. He's already picturing this young man handling his mules. Meanwhile, at the luxury end of the market, Exoticism itself carried weight. Buyers craved something rare, an Ethiopian with striking features to serve as a household guard, or a tall blonde from Germania to impress dinner guests. Status was measured not only in wealth but in the diversity of your staff. A Roman noble might boast, "My cook is Greek, my doorman German, my stable hand Thracian." It was cultural one-upmanship, flaunting power through ethnic variety, and the sensory details remained sharp. The smell of oil rubbed into skin before sale, the glint of gilded collars on those meant for higher households, the murmur of the crowd as they assess not just bodies but entire backstories. You catch phrases, too many scars, excellent teeth, rare hair color, as if overhearing modern shoppers critique fabric. The comedy sneaks in too. Imagine a Roman wife insisting on a slave with nice hair for the household, or a master boasting at dinner about how much he paid because his new attendant had the ideal nose. You almost laugh because humans haven't changed. We still attach irrational value to appearance. The only difference is that here it decided someone's entire fate. As the sun dips, the branded man is led away, purchased cheaply for heavy labor. The Greek youth goes in the opposite direction, snapped up by a senator with a swollen purse. Two lives diverge, dictated by scars and origin. And you, drifting among them, realize that Rome's market wasn't only about price, it was about stories written on the skin, the myths attached to ethnicity, the weight of a body as both biography and commodity. The market hum still clings to you, but now your gaze shifts toward the marble-clad arcades where Rome's elite linger. This isn't the noisy bargain end of the square with farmers haggling for field hands. This is where senators, equestrians, and even emperors strolled with the same calm air you bring to choosing a bottle of wine. Tonight, you're walking in their shadow, watching how Rome's wealthiest shopped for human beings as if collecting rare artifacts. A senator adjusts his snowy toga, one hand resting casually on a golden fibula pin. His steward stands beside him, purse heavy with array. They're not looking for strong backs to till fields. That's peasant stuff. They're eyeing the luxury items, a flute player trained in Athens, a clever scribe who can write faster than anyone in the Curia, maybe even a philosopher for long, tedious dinner conversations. Here's the mainstream fact. Wealthy households often own dozens, even hundreds of slaves, each one assigned a specialized role. Some were cooks, others personal barbers, some simply there to fan their master at mealtimes. Owning highly skilled slaves became a symbol of cultural capital. To the elite, it was the Roman equivalent of flaunting a fleet of sports cars. You pause as an auctioneer waves toward a tall, soft-spoken man whose placard proclaims him musician of Rhodes. The bids start high. The senator doesn't blink, casually raising a hand as though picking up olives. His face shows no tension. After all, his estate earns enough in rent to cover such purchases. Historians still argue whether these stories of casual extravagance were exaggerated by satirists, but the image persists, a class of men so wealthy they bought philosophers as easily as sandals. And then, the quirky tidbit, some emperors went overboard. Suetonius tells us Nero once paid absurd amounts for performers and artists, slaves who could sing, play instruments, or stage elaborate banquets. One rumor even claimed he bought an entire troupe of actors just to perform tragedies for his private amusement. Imagine swiping your imperial credit card for a live-in Shakespeare company. The extravagance is absurd enough to make you chuckle. You follow the senator deeper into the portico, where the shade is cool and the scent of incense drifts faintly from a nearby shrine. Here, sellers present their most expensive stock. A Greek tutor bows, reciting lines of Homer to prove his skill. A Syrian accountant demonstrates quick sums on a wax tablet, stylus scratching briskly. A Roman matron leans in, eyes sharp. She's picturing her household books balanced to perfection. Meanwhile, across the way, an emperor's agent makes discreet purchases. He points to a tall Nubian man whose placard describes him as a guard, an ornament to the household. The price is high, but image matters. The emperor doesn't just want protection, he wants spectacle. Having exotic figures standing in his halls announces power louder than any speech. And you catch yourself smirking at the comparison. Senators basically treated their staff like customizable gadgets, one to pour wine, one to trim beards, one to recite poetry on demand. If you think modern people collect apps on their phones, Romans collected slaves in much the same way, each one filling a niche, a little luxury feature in the operating system of daily life. Still, not everything was indulgence. You overhear one wealthy landowner muttering about the cost of replacing a missing cook. His steward shakes his head, noting that the previous cook had run away. The solution? Spend even more on a replacement because his dinner parties depend on it. The elite weren't just spoiled, they were trapped by their own image. Historians still argue whether this dependence on high-status slaves made Rome's aristocracy less self-reliant, a sort of gilded cage of luxury. The sensory details linger. You hear the crisp rustle of linen togas brushing past, the quiet clink of gold coins pouring into the auctioneer's chest, the faint strains of a Greek boy's lyre plucked nervously to prove his worth. The atmosphere is hushed, polished, a world away from the rowdy bargain stalls. And then the comedy sneaks in again. You imagine a senator bragging at dinner, "Ah yes, my barber is from Cappadocia, the finest hands in the empire." His friend rolls his eyes, countering, "Well, mine is Egyptian, and he oils hair better than anyone in Rome." Status competitions turned into hairdresser one-upmanship. You chuckle, realizing people haven't changed, they just had more marble around them back then. As the deals conclude, attendants lead the new purchases away. The senator adjusts his toga once more satisfied. For him, it's a casual day's shopping. For the slaves, it's a shift in the axis of their world. You, drifting through the scene, sense the strange duality. To Rome's elite, a purchase was a detail. To those purchased, it was destiny. The bustle of the porticos fades, and now you find yourself inside a grand Roman villa. The sun falls gently through latticed windows, painting stripes of gold across mosaic floors. Somewhere water trickles softly from a courtyard fountain, and the faint smell of olive oil bread drifts in from the kitchen. Tonight, you're walking through the inner machinery of a wealthy household, the hidden economy where slaves weren't just laborers but the backbone of daily life. Your first step takes you into the atrium. A doorman stands by the entrance, tall and immovable, eyes scanning like a sentinel. His job is simple but symbolic. He is the face of the household, the human version of a welcome mat. In Rome, appearance was everything, and even a door slave could be chosen for height or looks. Imagine ringing a doorbell only to be greeted by someone hand-picked like fine furniture. Beyond him in the tablinum, scribes sit hunched over wax tablets, styluses scratching like the hum of crickets. These household accountants record rents, tally grain shipments, and keep track of household expenses. Here's the mainstream fact. Many Roman estates employed literate slaves as bookkeepers, some more skilled in numbers than their masters. In a way, the empire's wealthiest citizens outsourced their financial lives entirely, trusting the sharp eyes and neat handwriting of their enslaved clerks. But not all work was so refined. Step into the bustling kitchen and the air shifts, hot, smoky, and alive with the sound of clattering pots. Cooks stir pots of lentil stew, roast meats on spits, and grind herbs with mortar and pestle. Each movement is fast, efficient, and drilled through repetition. Roman cuisine wasn't simple. Wealthy households demanded elaborate dishes, and the cooks' value soared if they could impress at banquets. You can almost taste the garum, fermented fish sauce, clinging to the air like an unforgettable perfume. And then, the quirky tidbit, some slaves specialized only in carving meat at the table. Their task wasn't just to slice pork neatly, but to do it with style, turning dinner into a performance. Imagine a whole job description boiled down to makes cutting roast duck look fancy. The Romans adored such flourishes. As you stroll further, the garden opens into view. Slaves tend grapevines, trim hedges into neat shapes, and scatter feed for doves. The scent of rosemary and thyme wafts upward, a reminder that Roman villas weren't just practical, they were cultivated displays of leisure. Guests wandering here were supposed to admire not only the plants, but the invisible labor that kept them thriving. In the quieter corners, tutors sit with children, reading aloud from scrolls. A boy fidgets, groaning over his Homer lesson, while the tutor sighs, adjusting his cloak. This is no ordinary teacher but a slave, often Greek, whose price might rival that of the entire kitchen staff combined. You hear the soft lilt of Greek phrases spilling into the villa's Latin air, a reminder that Rome's elite never stopped borrowing culture from their conquered neighbors. Historians still argue whether slaves in these roles gained any prestige themselves or were always invisible extensions of their master's wealth. Some evidence suggests trusted scribes or tutors could hold influence within the household. Others insist they remained, at the end of the day, property, That tension lingers in the silence after the lesson ends, as the boy scampers off and the tutor returns to his corner, eyes unreadable. Now you step into the triclinium, the dining hall. Reclining couches circle a low table already set for an evening feast. Slaves glide silently, placing dishes and pouring watered wine. Their movements are choreographed like dancers, quick, efficient, unobtrusive. You can almost hear the soft shuffle of sandals on mosaic and the faint chime of bronze cups. For the guests, it's all effortless hospitality. For the staff, it's precision labor honed over years. And here's where the comedy creeps in. Imagine a clumsy new attendant spilling wine on a senator's toga. The room gasps, the poor slave freezes, and the master sighs dramatically. Dinner is ruined, or at least delayed until the wine dries. You almost laugh at the universality of it. 2,000 years later, spilled drinks still have the power to derail a party. As you drift room to room, you sense the villa's heartbeat. Every chamber hums with labor. The scraping of styluses, the chopping of herbs, the shuffle of sandals, the low murmur of lessons. Without these enslaved figures, the grand villa would fall silent, its luxury collapsing into dust. To its master, they are investments. To you watching, they are the unseen symphony that keeps Rome's elite world alive. From the tiled atrium of the villa, your steps now lead outward, beyond the fragrant gardens and shaded porticos, into the hard, sun-baked expanses where Rome's economy drew its deepest breath, the fields and the mines. Here, the cost of human life was measured not in poetry or polished manners, but in sweat, exhaustion, and survival. Tonight, you are walking through the countryside and down into the earth itself, tracing how the Romans valued bodies destined for the harshest labor. Your sandals crunch on dry soil as you enter a vast estate outside the city, rows of vines stretching across the hillside. A group of chained workers bends low, hands rough from pruning. Their backs glisten with sweat under the Mediterranean sun. These are the cheap buys, the unskilled field hands snapped up in bulk after military campaigns. For a few hundred denarii each, landowners filled their estates with laborers who tilled, planted, and harvested until their bodies gave out. Here's the mainstream fact. Latifundia, those massive estates owned by Rome's elite, were run almost entirely by slave labor. Grain, olives, and grapes, the staples of Roman wealth, depended on armies of exhausted workers. Without them, Rome's food supply would have withered. But fields, as brutal as they were, pale beside the mines. You descend into a shaft, the air damp and close, the flicker of oil lamps casting trembling shadows. The sound of pickaxes echoes like muffled thunder. Slaves crouch in narrow tunnels, hacking at rock, hauling baskets of ore, their bodies caked in grime. If farm work drained strength slowly, the mines devoured it quickly. Many never emerged alive. You feel the heavy air pressing on your chest, and you instinctively want to retreat. The quirky tidbit, Roman law sometimes sentenced criminals to the mines as the harshest punishment, called damnatio ad metalla. It was considered worse than death because it prolonged suffering. You chuckle dryly at the idea of worse than death being a line item on the legal code, but it captures the pitilessness of the system. In terms of cost, these workers were cheap, sometimes frighteningly so. Mine slaves and field gangs were purchased in bulk, their lives seen as expendable tools. A wealthy landowner might buy 50 captives at once, calculating how many seasons of labor he could extract before needing replacements. Historians still argue whether this reliance on disposable labor eroded Rome's incentive to develop better technology. Why invent a new plow when you can just buy 10 more Gauls? The sensory details linger. In the fields, the smell of crushed grapes and trampled earth mixes with sweat. In the mines, it is dust, oil smoke, and the sharp tang of metal. The sounds differ too. Above ground, the distant songs of birds. Below, the rasp of breathing and the rhythmic strike of pick on stone. Both soundscapes lull you, not because they're gentle, but because repetition makes them almost hypnotic. Occasionally, landowners experimented with incentives. Some gave field slaves modest rations of wine or short breaks to encourage productivity. Others relied solely on whips and threats. You picture two neighboring estates, on one overseers distributing olives as rewards, on the other overseers brandishing rods. Both estates hum with activity, both produce harvests, yet the philosophies couldn't be more different. Historians still argue which approach was more effective, though the very debate feels chilling in its matter-of-factness. And yes, comedy has a way of sneaking in, even here. Imagine a slave muttering under his breath about the ridiculousness of pruning vines for someone else's wine, only to be shushed by a companion. You smirk, realizing workplace grumbling is eternal, whether in Roman fields or modern offices. As you step back from the mine's edge, you glance toward the horizon where villas gleam white against the hills. The owners of these estates will never feel the dirt under their nails or the darkness of the shafts. They will sip their wine, reap their profits, and tally their ledgers. For them, slaves in fields and mines are numbers. For you, wandering through this scene, they are the pulse that keeps Rome's economy alive. Expensive to buy, yes, but tragically cheap to keep. From the sun-scorched vineyards and the dark, suffocating mines, your steps now echo into the busy streets of the city. Rome isn't only a place of politics and temples, it is also a humming workshop, a bakery with smoke curling from chimneys, a tavern spilling laughter into the alley. And here, among the clatter and chatter, slaves toil not in chains beneath the earth, but in storefronts and backrooms, urban industries where value was tied directly to skill. You start with the bakeries. The smell hits you first. Warm bread, yeast rising, crust crackling in ovens as hot as summer streets. Inside, slaves knead dough with rhythm, muscles straining as they pound flour and water into form. Some grind grain on massive rotary mills powered by donkey or man, the grinding stones groaning with each turn. The work is repetitive, yes, but it's also a skill, and skilled bakers fetched higher prices than field hands. You imagine a Roman buyer boasting, "This fellow can bake loaves for 100 customers a day, worth every denarius." Here's the mainstream fact. Bakeries were often staffed almost entirely by slaves, sometimes owned by freedmen who had once been bakers themselves. Their value lay in reliability. Bread was Rome's staple, and keeping ovens hot meant keeping citizens fed. But the city's industries didn't stop at bread. Step into a noisy workshop where bronze clinks against stone. Slaves here hammer out pots, utensils, even decorative fittings for temples. Sparks fly, smoke stings your nose, and the overseer wipes sweat from his brow while barking orders. These men are specialists, and the cost of buying them reflects their training. A skilled blacksmith might be worth 3 or 4 unskilled laborers, his craft ensuring steady profit for his master. And then, the quirky tidbit, some slaves in urban shops were rented out by the hour. Need an extra pair of hands for a big project? Pay the owner, borrow the worker, return him when done. It's the ancient Roman equivalent of short-term gig labor. You chuckle, imagining a sign, "Slave for hire, reasonable rates, no refunds if he complains." You wander into a tavern next, the air thick with smoke and sour wine. Barmaids bustle about, pouring drinks, fetching food, sweeping up spilled garum from the floor. Many are slaves, valued for their quickness and charm. Some masters deliberately placed attractive slaves in taverns, hoping their presence would draw more customers. You smirk, because even in ancient Rome, marketing sometimes boiled down to good looks. Historians still argue whether these urban positions offered slaves more freedom of movement than their rural counterparts. Some suggest that city life allowed a taste of independence, opportunities to interact with free people, earn tips, or even save peculium for self-purchase. Others point out the constant oversight, the risk of theft, and the ever-present reminder that wages, no matter how high, flowed back to the master. The debate lingers like smoke in the tavern air. And yet there is humor even here. Imagine a sleepy baker yawning at dawn, muttering that he wishes the gods had invented self-baking bread, or a tavern worker rolling her eyes at yet another drunken legionary slurring the same bad joke. You realize workplace humor is eternal. Rome had its share of eye rolls and whispered sarcasm behind the boss's back. The sensory chorus continues, the crackle of bread crusts, the clang of metalwork, the laughter and slurred songs spilling out of taverns into dark alleys. Each sound is distinct, yet all blend into the lull of a living city, where slavery is woven into the fabric of commerce as invisibly as mortar between bricks. By the time you step back into the open forum, you notice how different these urban industries feel compared to the fields and mines. Here, skill raises value, and the investment in training creates a slightly longer tether between master and slave. These aren't disposable laborers. They're human capital in the truest Roman sense, every bit as important to the empire's survival as the farmers bending in the fields. The city's clang of metal and the yeasty perfume of bakeries linger in your nose, but now your feet take you down a quieter side street where a different form of trade unfolds, not ownership, but rental. Tonight, you're drifting into the odd Roman world of leasing slaves, where people could be hired out by the day, the job, or even the hour, like human equipment. You pass a small workshop with its shutters half open. Inside, a slave sharpens tools on a whetstone, sparks leaping like fireflies. His master leans at the doorway, whispering to a neighbor, "Need him for a few hours? 2 denarii, and he's yours till sundown." The transaction is quick, casual, like borrowing a ladder. You smirk at the absurdity. Rome had its own gig economy, long before delivery apps or freelance websites. Here's the mainstream fact. Roman law allowed slaves to be hired out, and many owners made tidy profits doing so. The state itself sometimes leased gangs of slaves to contractors for large building projects. If you imagine scaffolding around a new basilica with dozens of sweaty figures hauling stone, there's a good chance some were temporary rentals. But the range of tasks could be surprisingly ordinary. A woman might rent a skilled seamstress for a day to finish a tunic. A tavern owner could hire extra servers during a festival rush. Some records even mention renting musicians for banquets, the Roman version of booking a live band. You picture guests reclining at dinner while a lyre player performs, then being let out afterward like a violin returned to its case. The quirky tidbit: slaves rented out for entertainment sometimes came with warnings written right into the contract. Do not overwork, do not strike, return in the same condition. You laugh quietly, realizing it sounds exactly like the fine print for renting a donkey cart. No racing, no jumping off cliffs. The thought of a Roman master filling out complaint forms after a party, "Returned my lyre player hoarse and tired, 0 stars," is too absurd not to grin at. As you wander, you sense the flexibility the system offered. Owners turned slaves into income streams without parting with them permanently, while renters gained access to skilled labor without the hefty purchase price. Historians still argue whether this practice was widespread in small households or mostly confined to wealthy estates and city industries. Some say it was rare, others see it as common sense in a bustling urban economy. The sensory details layer over you, the clink of coins passed hand to hand, the rustle of papyrus contracts signed and sealed, the sound of sandals hurrying as a rented messenger dashes through crowded streets. Somewhere a cook is being whisked away to prepare a wedding feast, the scent of herbs trailing behind him. Another day, another transaction, another reminder that people could be treated like borrowed tools. And comedy, of course, sneaks in again. Imagine 2 neighbors arguing because one rented a slave to paint a wall and the paint job turned out lopsided. Or a party host fuming because his rented harpist played off key. You almost hear the snickers in the background. Should have sprung for the deluxe package. By the time you leave the side street, the idea has sunk in. In Rome, ownership wasn't the only model. Leasing human labor blurred the lines even further between person and property, turning lives into flexible assets shuffled about like amphorae of wine. To the Romans, it was practical. To you, strolling softly through the city's alleys, it is surreal. Another reminder of how deeply commerce seeped into the marrow of daily life. You leave behind the bustling alleys of leased labor and step now into a dimly lit atrium, where the laughter is softer, the perfume heavier, and the stakes much higher. Tonight, you're drifting through the world of luxury companionship, the peculiar corner of Rome's slave economy, where some skyrocketed not for muscle or skill with tools, but for beauty, intimacy, and presence. Picture a lavish dinner party. The triclinium glows with oil lamps, shadows dancing on frescoed walls. Guests recline on couches while slaves circulate with platters of honey cakes and jugs of wine. But here, among the entertainers, singers, and musicians, a more exclusive presence draws attention: the companion. These were men and women whose value lay in conversation, charm, or simply the way they moved in a room. Here's the mainstream fact. Certain slaves, especially courtesans and attendants, were sold for astonishing prices. Records mention figures high enough to buy entire estates. Why? Because wealthy Romans saw companionship as both status symbol and a personal indulgence. It wasn't enough to serve food. You needed someone witty to flatter your guests, someone stylish to drape your cloak just so, or someone graceful to sit by your couch while you mused on philosophy. And then the quirky tidbit: some wealthy Romans kept sleep companions, not just for intimacy, but simply for comfort, like human hot water bottles. Ancient writers joke about slaves tucked into beds to warm the sheets before the master arrived. You smirk, picturing a senator sighing, "Ah, nothing like perfectly pre-warmed linens." Practical? Maybe. Ridiculous? Definitely. The economics were brutal. Beauty, charm, or talent in music or dance could make a person's price soar. A gifted singer, purchased young, might be trained for years at the master's expense before being presented as a luxury companion. By the time they were showcased, their value rivaled that of prize gladiators. You imagine the bids escalating, 2,000 denarii, 5,000. The crowd gasps, and somewhere a farmer buying field hands shakes his head in disbelief. Historians still argue whether Roman elites truly prized companionship for refinement or whether it was all about ostentation, buying the most expensive, most beautiful person simply to show off. Satirists like Juvenal suggest the latter, mocking the wealthy for flaunting slaves like jewelry. Yet letters and inscriptions hint at genuine affection, blurred though it was by ownership. The debate drifts unresolved, like smoke curling in the lamplight. You wander further into this imagined villa. A woman in silk gestures to her handmaid who adjusts her hairpins with delicate precision. Her value is not only in obedience but in taste, knowing exactly how to style a coiffure to impress at the theater. Another companion kneels to lace sandals, the movement graceful enough to seem rehearsed. These are luxuries measured not in survival but in display. And here comes the comedy. Picture a Roman bragging, "My attendant costs more than your entire vineyard." The guest rolls his eyes, muttering, "Yes, but can he prune vines?" It's absurd yet perfectly Roman to equate prestige with the price tag of someone who pours your wine or whispers clever lines in your ear. The sensory details hum softly, the sweet tang of incense, the faint pluck of a lyre in the background, the brush of silk against mosaic. These companions blend into the scene like delicate ornamentation, never quite invisible but never fully free. Their worth lies in being seen, admired, and envied. As you step back from the feast, the numbers echo again. A farm slave, a few hundred denarii, a mine laborer, perhaps less. But a beautiful singer with a perfect voice, priceless or nearly so. You realize the math of Rome was never only about utility, it was also about vanity, image, and the hunger to be surrounded by beauty, even if purchased at staggering costs. You drift away from the lamplight and laughter of the villa's banquet hall, down a quieter road that smells of dust and warm straw. The scene is softer now. A group of children standing in a line, their small shoulders hunched, placards swinging gently from their necks. Tonight you're walking through one of the most unsettling corners of the Roman slave market, the sale of children, where price was shaped not by strength already proven, but by potential yet unseen. Your eyes catch a boy no older than 7, his tunic hanging loose, his hair cropped close. His placard reads simply "Novice, new, untrained." Buyers circle like cautious gamblers. One man mutters, "He'll grow strong, I can shape him as I please." Another frowns, eyeing the boy's thin wrists, and walks away. The price here is low, children often sold for far less than adults, but the calculations ran deeper than the numbers on the tablet. A child could be molded, trained, and eventually resold for profit, a cruel investment strategy whispered among shrewd traders. Here's the mainstream fact. Roman sources confirm that child slaves were common, especially after wars, when entire families were captured and separated. Younger children fetched lower prices, yet many masters saw them as valuable long-term assets. They were malleable, less likely to resist, and could be instructed from an early age in specific trades. But then the quirky tidbit, some buyers specifically sought out children for domestic tasks, not heavy labor, believing small hands were useful for jobs like threading needles or polishing delicate ornaments. Imagine the absurdity of a placard boasting, "Excellent for dusting fine figurines." You smirk, even as the image weighs heavily on you. You picture a wealthy matron leaning close to inspect a young girl with large, anxious eyes. The woman whispers to her steward, "She will make a fine maid once trained." The steward nods, already calculating the cost of feeding her until she's old enough to work properly. The girl clutches the edge of her tunic, silent, as her future is bartered away for fewer coins than the price of a mule. Historians still argue whether Romans truly saw child slaves as long-term investments or whether many simply perished under the strain of poor conditions before they could repay their cost. The debate lingers unresolved, casting a long shadow of the economic logic of the marketplace. In some cases, children were purchased specifically to be educated, raised alongside a master's own children as playmates, or companions. These household juniors sometimes grew up speaking fluent Latin and Greek, serving as tutors or attendants. Imagine the strange sight, a Roman child reciting Virgil while a slave child echoes the lines back, both learning together, yet only one free. The sensory details here are quieter than the clamor of adult auctions. You hear the small shuffling of feet, the high-pitched sniffles of children too tired to cry loudly, the murmurs of buyers deciding futures with brisk indifference. The smell of wax tablets, sweat, and warm hay mixes with the faint sweetness of figs sold at a nearby stall. The contrast is sharp, sweetness for some, bitterness for others. And yes, even here, comedy creeps in sideways. Picture a stern Roman father buying a child slave to help tutor his son, only for the tutor in training to outshine the boy in lessons. You can almost hear the sighs. I paid for a servant, not a reminder of my child's laziness. The humor is soft, ironic, but it glimmers faintly in the darker scene. By the end of the day, the children are led away, some to kitchens, some to workshops, some to villas where their fates hang in the balance. For the buyers, the purchase is a wager on the future. For the children, it is the quiet, bewildering beginning of lives shaped entirely by others. And for you, standing at the edge of the marketplace, it is a lullaby of footsteps fading into the evening, small echoes swallowed by the vastness of Rome. The children's footsteps fade into the dusk, but the marketplace doesn't grow quieter, it grows sharper. You move into a colonnade where buyers and sellers argue not about songs or smiles, but about contracts, loopholes, and guarantees. Tonight, you are stepping into the paperwork side of Roman slavery, where buying a human being wasn't just an exchange of coins, but a legal transaction complete with warranties, disclaimers, and lawsuits waiting in the wings. Picture a seller standing beside a nervous young man. The seller raises a hand and calls out, "Strong, healthy, trained in carpentry." A buyer frowns, arms folded. "Any illnesses? Any history of escape?" The seller hesitates. A steward steps forward with a wax tablet, ready to record terms. This isn't just haggling, it's law in action. Here's the mainstream fact. Roman legal codes, especially under the Aedil's edict, required sellers to disclose serious defects in slaves. Epilepsy, chronic illness, repeated escape attempts all had to be declared. If not, the buyer could later sue for fraud. Imagine a Roman equivalent of returning a faulty product. "This slave fainted 3 times in a week. I demand compensation." But the quirky tidbit, sellers sometimes tried to spin defects as features, a brand mark for attempted escape, proof of strength and courage. A limp? Ideal for light duties, won't wander far. You chuckle because it's the oldest marketing trick in the book, turning lemons into lemonade, even when the lemon is a scarred Thracian with a bad knee. Contracts could get astonishingly specific. Some promise that a slave has not attempted suicide or does not worship forbidden gods. Others set warranties for 30 or 60 days, after which the risk passed entirely to the buyer. You smirk, imagining the awkward conversations when a warranty claim had to be made. "Excuse me, sir, your former slave keeps talking back. Do I get a refund?" Historians still argue whether these warranties truly protected buyers or whether they were more symbolic, shifting blame away from sellers once the ink dried. Surviving contracts show both careful detail and blatant loopholes, leaving scholars to puzzle over how consistently the rules were enforced. The sensory details draw you in. You hear the scratching of styluses on wax, the murmurs of men in togas reading clauses aloud, the sharp snap of seals pressed into clay. The smell of ink and olive oil fills the air. It's quieter than the auction square, but in some ways more intense. This is where fortunes are safeguarded or lost. And humor creeps in, as always. Imagine a master suing another because the excellent singer he bought turned out tone deaf, or someone fuming that their perfect cook burned lentils. You can almost hear the laughter of bystanders. Next time, test the product before you buy. Even the law couldn't strip the absurdity from a system that treated people like returnable goods. Sometimes the contracts dealt with manumission, the promise of eventual freedom. A buyer might agree to free a slave after faithful service, writing it directly into the terms. Of course, the seller might neglect to mention that the slave had already been promised freedom by a previous master. You picture the chaos, a slave with 3 different freedom clauses caught in a legal tug of war like a prize no one wants to give up. By the time you drift from the colonnade, the murmur of legal Latin still buzzes in your ears. You realize Rome's slave market wasn't just noisy auctions and sweaty haggling, it was also a paper empire of clauses, seals, and contracts. To the Romans, a purchase wasn't complete until the wax tablet bore the imprint of agreement. To you, it feels like another surreal reminder that even the most human of exchanges could be buried under the cold scratch of legalese. The echoes of wax tablets and legal guarantees still hum in your ears, but the atmosphere shifts as you wander further into the forum. The laughter dulls, the chatter dims, and the stories you hear now are darker. The tales of dangerous investments, of slaves who sickened, rebelled, or simply vanished into the streets. Tonight, you're walking through the risks of ownership, the moments when Roman buyers discovered their expensive purchases could turn out to be liabilities instead of assets. Your first stop is the sick room. Imagine a villa where a newly bought farmhand lies shivering on a straw mat. His master frowns, realizing the strong gall he purchased last month now can't lift a basket. The overseer mutters, "He was cheaper than the others, sir. Perhaps now we see why." Here's the mainstream fact. Sickness was one of the greatest fears for buyers. A sick slave not only lost productivity but could infect others in the household. Some buyers even tried to return their purchases if illness appeared within the warranty period. You can almost hear the grumbling, "Do I look like a hospital?" But illness wasn't the only risk. Picture a young man with sharp eyes slipping into the crowd of Rome, vanishing down alleys before his master notices he's gone. Runaways were common enough that walls and trees sometimes carried posted notices offering rewards for their return. These ads listed physical traits, hair color, scars, accents, as if describing a missing mule. You smirk, imagining the awkwardness of explaining to your dinner guests, "Yes, I had an excellent cook, but he's currently somewhere between the Circus Maximus and the Tiber." And here's the quirky tidbit. Romans employed professional slave catchers, men who specialized in tracking fugitives through the city and countryside. Some even carried dogs. It's the ancient equivalent of hiring a bounty hunter, only instead of chasing criminals, they're after your runaway barber. Historians still argue whether rebellion among slaves was truly common or whether writers exaggerated fears to justify strict control. Certainly, large-scale revolts like Spartacus' uprising terrified Romans, but day-to-day resistance was subtler: slow work, broken tools, feigned illness. These everyday rebellions might never make headlines, but they cost masters dearly in patience and coin. The sensory details of these risks are sharp. In the villa, the sour smell of sweat and sickness seeps from the sick room. In the city, the slap of sandals echoes as a fugitive darts through alleys, heart pounding. At the forum, a nervous buyer hesitates, weighing whether to purchase a man with a branded forehead that reads "Fug," a permanent reminder of past escape. And yes, comedy sneaks in even here. Imagine a master complaining at market that his expensive scribe keeps correcting my Latin grammar, or a buyer returning a surly cook. "This fellow insists cumin ruins every dish. I can't live like this." Even the risks sometimes read like darkly comic anecdotes, absurd footnotes in the ledgers of empire. You step into the stables, where a guard leans against a post, muttering about an incident the week before. A Thracian slave, strong as an ox, snapped one day and struck his overseer. The guard shakes his head. "Expensive waste, could have earned us 20 harvests." The phrase lands with weight, lives reduced to the math of expected returns, now lost. And hovering over it all is the simple truth. Buying a slave was never guaranteed profit. Like purchasing livestock, property, or tools, it came with risks. Only here, the tools had wills of their own, minds that could resist, bodies that could falter. The Romans may have written warranties and laws, but no contract could stop a man from running. No clause could prevent a cough from spreading. By the time you leave this shadowed corner of Rome, you sense the tension behind every purchase. For buyers, slaves were investments, yes, but investments that could turn suddenly, unpredictably, disastrously human. The murmurs of risk and rebellion fade, and now your steps carry you toward a quieter, stranger arithmetic, the economics of freedom. Tonight, you're standing at the threshold of manumission, the act of setting a slave free, and discovering how the decision was less about generosity and more about prestige, politics, and cold calculation. Picture a Roman master seated in his atrium, sunlight filtering across his toga as he dictates to a scribe. At his feet kneels a middle-aged servant who has served faithfully for decades. The master lifts a hand. "I free you." The words are spoken formally, sometimes even before a magistrate, and with them, One life shifts. But here's the catch. The freedman now owes his former master loyalty, political support, and often continued service. Freedom came with strings, and those strings pulled tight. Here's the mainstream fact. Manumission was common enough that freedmen, liberti, formed a huge class in Rome. Many became artisans, shopkeepers, even wealthy patrons themselves. Their children born free could rise higher still, sometimes all the way into the Senate. To a master, freeing a slave was a way to expand his network of loyal clients, a kind of long-term investment in influence. But there was money in it too. Some masters charged their slaves for freedom. A man might save wages or tips, peculium, then hand over a tidy sum in exchange for release. To the master, it was win-win. Profit today and prestige tomorrow, when the freedman continued to honor him as patron. You smirk at the cynical brilliance. Rome even monetized generosity. The quirky tidbit, Augustus, worried about too many slaves being freed, passed laws limiting how many could be manumitted at once. Imagine an emperor muttering, "No, you can't just free 30 in a day, it clogs the system." Bureaucracy even found its way into mercy. Historians still argue whether manumission was primarily altruistic or strategic. Some inscriptions speak tenderly of masters freeing beloved companions. Others drip with calculation, treating manumission as an economic tool. The truth, like so much in Rome, lies somewhere in between, affection and arithmetic entwined. The sensory details paint it all. In the Forum, a magistrate's voice echoes as he declares freedom, the crowd murmuring approval. In the villa, you hear the snap of a wax tablet as terms are recorded. In the temple, incense rises as masters free slaves in religious ceremonies, tying piety to prestige. Freedom always had a soundtrack, a smell, a ritual. And humor, oddly enough, finds a corner here too. Imagine a master freeing his old cook only to hire him back because no one else seasons lentils properly. Or a senator whispering, "I freed him, but he still refuses to laugh at my jokes." Freedom didn't erase relationships, it twisted them into new, sometimes ridiculous shapes. As you drift further, you picture rows of tombs outside Rome, their inscriptions carved in stone. Many belong to freedmen proudly announcing their new status. Marcus, freedman of Lucius, now merchant of wool. You run your fingers across the imagined letters, feeling the pride and relief behind them. Each one is a reminder that freedom, while calculated, still mattered deeply to those who gained it. By the time you leave this section of the city, you realize manumission wasn't simply about release. It was about math and prestige, profit and legacy. To the master, it was an investment. To the freedman, it was rebirth. And to you, wandering through this scene, it feels like the strangest equation of all, how Rome managed to turn even freedom into another form of currency. The marble inscriptions of freedmen fade from sight, and now your thoughts trail after the quieter, more personal stories, the slaves who didn't wait for their master's generosity but scraped, bargained, and strategized their way to freedom. Tonight, you're following the lives of those who saved peculium, that tiny allowance or side earning, to buy themselves back. Picture a cobbled Roman street at dawn. A slave baker, flour dust clinging to his arms, slips a copper coin into a hidden pouch beneath his tunic. It's not much, just a fraction of a denarius, but it's his. Day by day, crumb by crumb, he builds a secret future. That's the rhythm of self-purchase, long, patient accumulation in a world designed to deny it. Here's the mainstream fact. Many Roman slaves could, with their master's permission, hold a peculium, a personal fund they technically didn't own but managed. Over years, sometimes decades, this fund could grow large enough to buy freedom. A good craftsman or merchant's assistant might earn tips, commissions, or small profits on the side, all slowly funneled into that invisible nest egg. And then the quirky tidbit, some masters actually encourage self-purchase, seeing it as profitable. A loyal slave might save diligently, hand over a substantial sum, and leave, only to remain tied to the master's client even after manumission. It was like selling a house at full price but still collecting rent afterward. You can't help chuckling at Rome's knack for turning even emancipation into a win-win for the elite. The sensory picture sharpens. You hear the scratch of a stylus as a slave carefully notes down each coin earned. You smell the warm, dusty scent of bread in the bakery where he works, the air thick with ambition disguised as routine. In the evening, he counts his savings by lamplight, the coins clinking softly like a lullaby of hope. Historians still argue how common successful self-purchase was. Some insist it was relatively frequent in urban trades, where tips and small earnings accumulated. Others point out how brutally slow the process must have been for field laborers or mine workers who had little opportunity to earn anything extra. For many, freedom by savings was a dream never realized. But some stories break through the gloom. Inscriptions survive of freedmen who proudly declared they bought their own liberty. Imagine reading Lucius, once slave of Marcus, now freedman by his own hand. The pride radiates even across centuries. And humor peeks in too. Picture a slave proudly announcing his self-purchase only for his master to sigh, "Excellent, now that you're free, I expect you'll keep baking my bread." It's the cosmic Roman joke. Freedom often meant doing the same work, just under a new title, with a bit more dignity sprinkled on top. The system even birthed small family economies. A slave woman might save peculium to free her child first, knowing she could always try for herself later. A father might buy freedom and then work furiously to save enough to liberate his wife. You picture evenings in a cramped insula room, the family whispering their plans by lamplight. Coins stacked like fragile steps toward tomorrow. The sensory world deepens, the flicker of lamps, the faint murmur of dreams, the coins warm from being hidden close to the body all day. Each clink carries not just value but defiance. By the time you step back into Rome's busy street, you feel the strange mix of patience and urgency. Self-purchase was slow, uncertain, risky, but it was real. For those who managed it, the weight of coins was the weight of a new life. And for you, drifting through the city, it becomes a gentle refrain. Even in Rome, even in chains, some carve their way toward freedom one coin at a time. The clink of coins saved in secret lingers in your ears, but now you turn toward the marble shadows of the Senate House and the gilded halls of emperors. Freedom, rebellion, self-purchase, these mattered, yes, but behind it all was politics, the way laws and decrees could tilt the price of a human life with the stroke of a stylus. Tonight you're wandering through the grand stage where emperors themselves manipulated the economics of slavery. Picture Augustus seated in a curule chair, the laurel crown resting lightly on his brow. He listens as senators mutter about too many slaves being freed at once. With a wave of his hand, he limits mass manumissions, tying politics to the price of liberty. Suddenly, slaves eligible for freedom become rare, and scarcity pushes their value up. You can almost hear the grumbling of buyers in the forum. Another law? Now even freedom costs more. Here's the mainstream fact. Roman emperors often regulated slavery directly through taxes, restrictions on manumission, or rules about inheritance. Under Claudius, for example, certain protections were granted against the outright killing of slaves, not from compassion, but to preserve economic value. Think of it as consumer protection with an imperial stamp. But the quirky tidbit, at one point, the Emperor Caligula was said to have staged mock auctions of palace servants, forcing senators to bid outrageous sums just to curry favor. Imagine attending an emperor's dinner party and walking out having accidentally purchased a jester for 20,000 sesterces simply because refusing to bid would insult the ruler. It's extortion dressed up as entertainment. You chuckle uneasily at how familiar that feels. Historians still argue whether these imperial manipulations were consistent policies or just erratic bursts of control. Some say Augustus genuinely wanted to regulate manumission. Others think he was simply worried about optics, a city filled with too many freedmen. Emperors like Nero, meanwhile, seem to have viewed slaves as opportunities for spectacle, caring less about stability than about personal whims. The sensory atmosphere is vivid. In the Senate, the scrape of sandals on marble, the rise and fall of voices debating taxes on sales. In the marketplace afterward, buyers clutch purses nervously, unsure whether today's price is natural fluctuation or a new imperial decree. It's like living with a stock market where Caesar himself sets the index. And, of course, comedy sneaks in. Imagine senators groaning because they had to pay a new tax on every slave purchase, then still bragging about how many they owned. Or an emperor smiling slyly as he enacts a rule that technically protects slaves, but mainly ensures they remain alive long enough to keep filling state coffers. You can almost hear a weary Roman quip. The emperor saves lives only so he can tax them longer. You stroll into a temple courtyard where a magistrate reads aloud the latest edict. The crowd listens, some nodding, others scowling. One man mutters that prices are climbing again. Another shrugs. What can you do? Rome was a place where politics and markets were inseparable, and in the world of slavery, law was just another lever. By the time you wander away, the lesson lingers. Emperors could manipulate human lives like numbers in an abacus, raising or lowering value as easily as moving beads. To the powerful, this was control. To the traders, it was an annoyance. And to you, drifting through Rome's marble halls, it's another lullaby of absurdity, an empire where freedom, loyalty, and even rebellion were subject to the ever-changing whims of politics. The murmur of imperial decrees fades as you turn a corner into a crowded row of stalls. Here, the air feels different, less marble, more sawdust and sweat. This is the world of the slave dealers themselves, the entrepreneurs of human traffic. Tonight, you're standing among the men who made fortunes buying, polishing, and reselling lives, sometimes with flair, sometimes with shameless deceit. A dealer waves at you with a broad grin, his fingers stained with ink from scribbling placards. Behind him stand a dozen new arrivals, freshly scrubbed, oiled, and dressed in simple tunics. "Straight from Cappadocia," he shouts, as though advertising wine. You can almost smell the olive oil gleaming on their skin, a cosmetic meant to hide scars or fatigue. These merchants were masters of presentation, and they knew first impressions could double a price. Here's the mainstream fact. Rome's slave trade was dominated by professional dealers, mangones, who purchased captives in bulk and resold them at markets across the empire. They acted as middlemen, transporting people from ports like Ostia to inland cities, ensuring constant supply. Without them, the system would have sputtered. But the quirky tidbit: mangones were notorious for tricks. They sometimes taught slaves to parrot useful Latin phrases, "Yes, master," "Strong worker," before sale. Some rubbed ash into cheeks to simulate a healthy glow, or even forced captives to eat heavily before auction to look sturdier. You smirk, realizing it's the ancient version of staging a house with new paint and flowers before selling it. The soundscape hums around you. The drone of hawkers advertising wares, the metallic clink of scales weighing coins, the muttered side bargains whispered in alleyways. One dealer flashes a golden tooth as he pockets a hefty sum. Another curses as a buyer insists on a warranty. You catch snippets of Latin: fortis, strong; doctus, educated; novus, new arrival. Each word is part sales pitch, part sentence. Historians still argue whether dealers were viewed as respectable businessmen or shady hustlers. Satirists mock them as unscrupulous tricksters, but archaeology reveals their wealth. Lavish tombs and inscriptions proudly recording their trade. Perhaps, like modern tycoons, they were hated and envied in equal measure. You pause at a stall where a boy stands with a placard reading "Knows numbers, trained in abacus." The dealer beams, "Perfect for your household accounts." The buyer squints, suspicious. Will the boy really be useful, or is this another polished sales trick? The tension between trust and doubt is palpable. And then the comedy creeps in. Imagine a customer storming back the next day shouting, "You sold me a philosopher. He won't stop questioning my orders." The dealer shrugs, grinning slyly. "I said he was clever. I never promised obedient." The crowd laughs. The sale stands. The sensory layer deepens as you picture wagons rumbling in, stacked not with goods, but with people. Dust rises, ropes creak, voices cry out. The dealers bustle like bees, each one eager to slice profit from misery. It's an unsettling carnival of commerce, absurd in its normalcy. By the time you drift away, the dealers' voices still echo in your ears. Part circus barker, part accountant, part trickster. To the Romans, they were indispensable middlemen. To you, walking softly through their stalls, they are the chorus that kept the machine of slavery oiled, laughing all the way to the bank. The chatter of the dealers fades, and your path now winds back toward the market floor, where a new debate hums quietly beneath the noise. Which slaves were worth more? The imported foreigners or the verni, those born inside Roman households? Tonight, you're weighing imported versus homeborn, two categories with different reputations, different price tags, and very different stories. First, the foreigners. Picture a ship docking at Ostia, ropes creaking, gulls screaming overhead. From its hold step, men and women with strange accents, pale hair or dark skin unfamiliar to Roman eyes. Their placards declare fresh from Thrace or captured in Dacia. Buyers crowd quickly. Foreign slaves could be exotic, their novelty adding allure. Strong Germans might serve as guards, Syrians as scribes, Greeks as tutors. Each origin came with a stereotype attached, and stereotypes shaped the bids. You hear the voices rising. A Gaul is cheaper, but hardy in the fields. A Greek is costly, but literate. Here's the mainstream fact. Rome imported vast numbers of captives from its wars, filling markets with foreigners whose prices varied by skills, looks, and origins. Many of these were bought cheaply in bulk, especially when war floods swamped the market. But the Verni homeborn slaves carried a different kind of value. Imagine a child raised within a villa from birth, familiar with the rhythms of the household, already obedient to its master's routines. These weren't strangers. They were investments raised like livestock, often more expensive than foreign newcomers. A Roman matron might lean to her steward and whisper, "Better Averna, he knows our ways, won't try to flee." And then the quirky tidbit: some Roman masters boasted about their verni as family ornaments. Inscriptions survive praising a faithful verna who served from infancy. It sounds disturbingly like bragging about a prized hunting dog, yet with an undertone of pride. Historians still argue which group fetched higher prices overall. Foreigners brought exotic skills and appearances, but Verne promised loyalty and predictability. One scholar suggests wealthy Romans leaned toward Verne for sensitive household roles, while foreigners were snapped up for labor or spectacle. Another insists the exoticism itself sometimes drove prices absurdly high, especially when status was on the line. You walk through the crowd, hearing fragments of buyers' arguments. "This one is Cappadocian, excellent with horses." "No, I'll take the boy born in the villa, he won't run." The voices are sharp, opinionated, each convinced of the better investment. It's as if you're overhearing rival shoppers debating brands at a market stall. The sensory notes are vivid. Foreigners smell of sea salt and dust from long marches. Their Latin is broken, their eyes darting nervously at unfamiliar surroundings. The Vernae, by contrast, shuffle with practiced obedience, their ears already trained to commands. The difference is palpable, freshly arrived versus deeply ingrained. And the comedy sneaks in, as always. Imagine a Roman wife exasperated with a newly purchased Gaul who doesn't understand her orders. "I said sweep, not sleep." She sighs, telling her husband they should have spent extra on a homeborn boy who already knows which end of a broom to hold. As you drift away, that argument still rings in your ears. Foreign import or homeborn investment, exotic novelty or steady reliability. To Rome's buyers, the choice was constant, like deciding between a flashy new tool and a tried and true one. To you, moving through the fading hum of the forum, it's another reminder of how lives were reduced to categories, stamped with value depending on where a person first drew breath. The debate between foreign and homeborn fades, and now your steps take you toward a livelier corner of Rome, where voices rise in song, the clash of swords rings out, and scribes scratch quickly by lamplight. Tonight, you're wandering into the forgotten roles, the entertainers, fighters, and intellectuals whose prices often soared beyond reason because they were valued less as laborers and more as celebrities. First, the actors. Imagine the stage of a small Roman theater, the smell of oil lamps and pine resin heavy in the air. A masked performer sweeps across the boards, his tunic flowing, his gestures exaggerated. Behind the curtain, his master grins. This actor is his property, and each performance fattens the household purse. Skilled stage slaves could be hired out for festivals or kept in permanent troops, and their price reflected the revenue they brought in. Owning one was like owning a touring musician today. You had the bragging rights and the profit. Here's the mainstream fact. Entertainers, especially actors and dancers, were sometimes sold for astronomical sums. Roman society looked down on the profession as disreputable, yet paradoxically adored the performances. A skilled actor could cost far more than a farmhand precisely because audiences craved the spectacle than the gladiators. You follow the sound of iron on iron to a training school near the edge of the city. Here, men spar in the dust, wooden swords clacking. Their muscles shine with sweat, overseers barking commands. A novice gladiator might be purchased cheaply, but a seasoned fighter with victories under his belt, his price could rival that of a villa. The thrill of seeing him in the arena was worth the gamble. Owners even insured these investments, betting on their survival. The irony is sharp. Men bought to die were sometimes too valuable to lose. The quirky tidbit: some gladiators became so popular that fans scrawled their names on walls, the ancient equivalent of posters and fan clubs. Imagine buying a slave and suddenly realizing he has a fan base bigger than yours. Awkward. And then there were scribes. Picture a dim workshop filled with the scratch of styluses on wax and the faint rustle of papyrus. Slaves trained in shorthand could record speeches in real time, their hands flying across tablets. Cicero himself depended on such scribes to capture his words. The cost of such skill? Enormous. Literate slaves were prized like living libraries, each one a walking archive. Historians still argue whether these celebrity slaves enjoyed better treatment or merely faced higher expectations. Were gladiators pampered between bouts or driven harder because of their price? Did scribes receive more freedom of movement or simply more pressure to never make mistakes? The evidence is scattered, the debates unresolved. The sensory world buzzes around you, the roar of a crowd echoing faintly from an arena, the smooth swish of a dancer's silk sash, the dry scent of ink in a scribe's chamber. You drift among them all, aware that here price wasn't about utility, it was about spectacle, prestige, and fame. And yes, the comedy sneaks in. Picture a master bragging at dinner. My gladiator just won 3 bouts in a row. His neighbor smirks. Yes, but my scribe wrote a poem about it without spelling errors. You chuckle softly because even in the strangest roles, Romans still competed for prestige like children arguing over toys. By the time you leave this corner of the city, you realize Rome's slave economy stretched far beyond kitchens and fields. It reached into the theater, the arena, the library, places where price was tied not to survival but to fame. To the Romans, these roles glittered with prestige. To you, standing in their shadows, they shimmer with surreal absurdity. The roar of the crowd and the scratch of styluses fade, and now your steps carry you back into the quieter spaces of Roman households and counting rooms, where another strange feature of this economy appears: insurance. Tonight, you're slipping into the world of safeguards and backup plans, where masters tried to protect their investments in human property as though guarding wagons of grain or herds of cattle. Picture a wealthy equestrian leaning over a wax tablet, his steward reading aloud. Clause 1. If the slave dies within 30 days of purchase, the seller must refund. The master nods, pressing his seal into clay. Already, you hear the anxious math in his mind. He's just spent the equivalent of a year's rent on a skilled scribe, and he won't let illness or accident drain that silver away. Here's the mainstream fact. Roman law allowed a kind of guarantee period during which a defective or sickly slave could be returned. But beyond that, some masters devised informal insurance schemes, agreements with dealers or even with temples, where sacrifices and contracts combined to secure divine or legal protection over an investment. Imagine buying a person and then essentially taking out an extended warranty. The quirky tidbit: some owners reportedly insured gladiators, whose value was tied directly to survival in the arena. Contracts might promise compensation if the fighter was killed too soon, especially if his death occurred outside the spectacle. You chuckle at the absurdity. It's the ancient equivalent of, if your star employee dies before the big show, you get your money back. Rome even turned blood sport into actuarial tables. The sensory details draw close. In the counting room, you smell beeswax melting from candles, the faint tang of bronze coins stacked neatly in rows. In the marketplace, you hear buyers and sellers arguing over warranty terms, their voices sharp and legalistic. In the amphitheater, the cheer of the crowd contrasts with the quiet whisper of investors calculating losses if their fighter falls. Historians still argue whether these insurance practices were widespread or limited to the wealthiest buyers. Some say most Romans simply accepted the risks of ownership, chalking up loss to fate. Others insist that shrewd contracts and guarantees were everywhere, protecting masters from financial ruin. The debate leaves the scene hazy, but the possibility remains vivid. And comedy sneaks in again. Imagine a frustrated Roman storming to a dealer. You sold me a defective cook. He can't even make garum properly. The dealer shrugs. Sorry, warranty expired yesterday. You almost hear the smirk in his voice, the eternal sting of fine print. Yet some masters sought spiritual insurance too. Temples offered blessings for slaves, prayers to keep them healthy and loyal. You picture a wealthy matron lighting incense to Asclepios, murmuring that her expensive Greek tutor must stay well, or at least well enough to keep her children quiet during lessons. divine protection, practical anxiety. As you drift from the counting rooms into the streets, you sense the strange duality. On one hand, slaves were treated like disposable tools. On the other, their high cost turned them into assets worth guarding, insuring, and even praying over. Rome wrapped its contradictions in contracts and incense smoke, trying to steady the unpredictable weight of human life turned into currency. By the time you step back into the night air, you hear it faintly. The creak of wax tablets closing, the soft thud of coins sealed in chests, the sigh of a master satisfied that his property is safe for now. For you, it becomes a lullaby of caution, a reminder that even in Rome, money and anxiety walked hand in hand. The wax tablets snap shut in your memory, but your feet now drift further out, beyond Rome itself, beyond Italy, into the wide arc of history. Tonight, you're comparing the Roman price of human life to other civilizations, Greek markets before them, Egyptian servitude along the Nile, even medieval Europe centuries later. In this panorama, Rome is not alone, but part of a longer, troubling tradition. Picture Athens in the 5th century BCE, a bustling agora, olives piled high, fish laid out on slabs, and in a quieter corner, slaves changing hands. A skilled artisan might fetch 300 drachmas, while unskilled laborers sold for far less. Greeks, like Romans, prized educated slaves, especially those captured from rival city-states. Historians still argue whether Athens relied more on citizen labor than Rome did, but the prices show the same logic. Brains and beauty cost more than brawn. Shift to Egypt, where the Nile glitters under the sun. Here, servitude often blended with debt, bondage, and corvée labor. The records of New Kingdom tombs speak of captives taken in war, handed over to temples or nobles. A healthy Nubian worker might be valued alongside cattle or copper tools, the math as utilitarian as Rome's. You smell papyrus scrolls inked with hieroglyphs, tallying grain and people side by side. Fast forward to medieval Europe. The slave markets of the early Middle Ages, Venetian traders in the Mediterranean, Norse raiders hauling captives to Dublin show echoes of Rome. A strong man might cost a handful of silver marks, a young girl far more. By the high medieval period, outright slavery gave way to serfdom, but the economic calculus remained. Labor tied to land, valued in rents instead of coins. You picture peasants bent in the fields, their price now hidden in harvest dues. The quirky tidbit: in some medieval ports, slaves were literally bartered for luxury goods. One Venetian record mentions a girl traded for a bolt of fine silk. Imagine haggling. She's worth at least 2 rolls of brocade. It's absurd and chilling, a direct echo of Rome's placards swinging in the foreign breeze. And yet Rome's scale dwarfed most others, tens of thousands of captives at once, entire provinces supplying bodies for markets. It was an economy saturated in human trade. Historians still argue whether Rome was uniquely reliant on slaves or simply more thorough in recording the transactions. Compared to Greece's smaller city-states or Egypt's temple-centered systems, Rome industrialized it, turning slavery into the engine of empire. The sensory notes wash over you, the bustle of Athens' agora, sharp with fish and figs, the dusty perfume of Egyptian papyrus scrolls, the salty spray of medieval docks where captives huddle on ships. Each scene is distinct, yet the rhythm feels familiar, voices bargaining, coins or goods clinking, futures decided with a handshake. And yes, the comedy peeks in, however dry. Imagine a medieval peasant complaining, "At least Roman slaves got wine rations, all I get is turnips." The bitterness would be real, but the comparison absurdly timeless. As you drift back toward Rome in your imagination, you realize that comparing prices across centuries is less about numbers than about patterns. Wherever labor was scarce, people turned other people into commodities. The coins changed, drachmas, sesterces, denarii, silver marks, but the logic remained: assign value, buy, sell, repeat. By the time you return to the Roman Forum in your mind, you feel the weight of continuity. Rome was not an outlier, but part of a long, unsettling melody in human history, one verse in a song that echoed before and after. The echoes of other civilizations fade, and once more you find yourself in Rome. Only now the streets are quieter, the Forum less crowded, the empire older. Tonight you're walking through the decline of this entire system, watching how the cost of slaves collapsed alongside Rome's fortunes, and how faint echoes lingered into later ages. The marble columns are chipped, weeds sprouting between stones. Where once auctions rang with shouts and coin clinks, now the marketplace is subdued. Fewer ships arrive at Ostia, fewer captives march through the gates. As Rome's armies falter, the supply of slaves dwindles. And without cheap labor flooding in, prices shift strangely, sometimes climbing in scarcity, sometimes dropping because demand itself shrinks. Imagine a merchant muttering, "No wars, no cargo, no cargo, no sales." The empire's lifeblood thins. Here's the mainstream fact. By the late empire, slavery declined not because of sudden morality, but because conquest slowed. Without constant wars, the supply dried up. Wealthy estates turned increasingly to tenant farmers and colonist labor, early seeds of medieval serfdom. But the quirky tidbit, some late Roman writers complained that households had become too dependent on slaves, even when they were fewer. One grumbled that aristocrats couldn't pour their own wine or lace their own sandals. You almost laugh, picturing a senator staring helplessly at his shoes, muttering, "What do I do without a servant?" It's absurd, but revealing. Historians still argue whether slavery ever truly ended in Rome or simply morphed into new forms. Some see the colonist system as disguised slavery, peasants bound to land instead of chains. Others argue it marked a real shift, tying labor to soil rather than sale. The debate lingers like the faint hum of voices in a nearly empty forum. The sensory picture is subdued. The once bustling auction square lies half empty, only a few sellers calling half-heartedly. The clink of coins is muted, the smell of olive oil and sweat replaced by dust and silence. Even the placards look faded, the chalk rubbed thin. And comedy still flickers in the ruins. Imagine an old aristocrat boasting at dinner. "In my youth we had 30 slaves in the kitchen." His guest shrugs. "Now I have only tenant farmers, and they still burn the bread." The banter carries on, even as the system crumbles. As you step back from the marketplace, you feel the weight of centuries. The Roman slave economy didn't vanish overnight, but it unraveled, strand by strand, until what remained was a shadow. And yet, echoes lingered in medieval markets, colonial plantations, even in whispered debates about freedom centuries later. The prices, the placards, the contracts, they're gone, but their memory flickers like an afterimage when you close your eyes. The city is dim now. Lamps gutter, cicadas hum in the distance, and the air cools across worn marble. You let the silence lengthen, softening each sound, slowing each breath. And so this journey closes, not with the clang of coins or the cries of auctions, but with the quiet truth that Rome's story of slavery is both specific to its time and hauntingly familiar across ages. A lullaby of markets, contracts, and human lives measured like goods, fading into the long night of history. And now, as the streets of Rome grow still, let the imagery soften around you. No more clamor of auctioneers, no more sharp clink of coins, just the hush of distant fountains, the whisper of wind brushing through colonnades, the faint glow of lamps flickering against marble. The empire fades, and so too does the noise. You sink into the rhythm of breath, slower now, longer, as though your body itself matches the pace of a quiet night in some forgotten villa. Picture the gardens by moonlight, shadows stretching across thyme and rosemary, a breeze carrying the faint sweetness of figs. The air is calm, the world unhurried. The people you followed, farmers bargaining for field hands, senators showing off tutors, children shuffled into strange futures, they all drift away into history. Their voices, once sharp and bustling, become distant echoes. You no longer need to measure prices, haggle over contracts, or tally coins on wax tablets. The math of Rome dissolves into silence. Let yourself imagine instead the soft murmur of cicadas in the countryside, or the gentle splash of water in a household fountain. The empire's burdens, its contradictions, its strange arithmetic, they fall away, leaving only stillness. If your thoughts wander, let them. They're like drifting smoke from an oil lamp, curling and thinning until they vanish. Nothing presses now. Nothing demands your attention. You're safe in the quiet of history's long night. So close your eyes. Let Rome's bustling form recede. Let its marble streets blur until all that remains is rest. The story has ended, but your sleep is just beginning.